morning, the small community awoke unaware that anything was wrong. It would be one of the resident nurses checking in after Madeline's mother missed breakfast that would discover the horror. Part 2. Chapter 14. Catalog. Ayala arrived at her regular meeting with Madeline with her usual sense of trepidation. She had nothing new to report, and she was frustrated. Over the last 2 months, she had built up an unprecedented intelligence network in the search for Lana. With full access to the US-UK program called Echelon, her team had set the ears and eyes of the massive processing power it encompassed to scour massive swaths of the world's phone calls and email traffic for any mention of a black-suited figure, or any other description that might fit the woman who had begun terrorizing them. But after the FBI and local police had pursued 1,000 hoaxes, false alarms, and even some near misses, they were still no closer to catching the agent known as Lana Wilson. As she had too many times before, Ayala had come to update Madeline on the situation. Though the updates had become more and more self-defeating, she had continued to answer her friend's requests for information without complaint, knowing it was the least she could do in the face of her continued failure to find her quarry. Usually their meetings were by teleconference, what with the wildly different locations Ayala's work now took her to. But because of this day's particularly important event, this meeting was going to be face-to-face, Madeline having a key role in the auspicious launch about to happen, and Ayala's specialized team being in charge of security. Still well in advance of the countdown, the two women met in a private conference room at Cape Canaveral. The meeting did not go well. "What the hell does she have to do, Ayala?" screamed Madeline. "Come up and punch you in the fucking face?" Ayala did not reply in kind, but in a calm voice reiterated her point. "We have been working around the clock to catch her, Madeline. I know that is no comfort to you, but it is all we can do. She is very clever and extremely resourceful. She is utterly fucking skinned. How difficult can it be to find a hairless, earless, pitch-black robot? For Christ's fucking sake, Ayala. How many of our family and friends does she have to kill before we stop her?" Ayala started to reply, again in her calm, conciliatory tone. But before she could, Madeline let a throaty scream of frustration escape her lips, her face turning red as she slammed her balled fists on the table. Ayala fell silent, standing across the table from her tormented friend and waiting to see if there was something else she could say. Knowing that she truly was doing everything she could to find their stalker, Ayala stood her ground and waited for her friend's tumultuous rage to subside. Madeline let her head fall into her hands, and the tears started to come again. Months before, they had tried to keep the pictures of her mother's corpse from her, but Madeline was almost as resourceful and well-connected as Ayala. Thoughts of what she had seen still haunted Madeline more often than she cared to admit. Madeline raised her head again, opening her bloodshot eyes wide. Whenever she closed them, the sight of her mother's naked, brutalized body came back to her, and so she kept her eyes transfixed on the far wall and gathered herself. Ayala watched her, drawing from a profoundly deep well of patience for her friend's grief. What had happened to Madeline's mother had been a terrifying return of the enemy they knew as Lana Wilson. After the initial shock, they had responded by gathering all of the team's close relatives together, secreting them in one of the nuclear fallout bunkers that lay hidden in the Colorado mountains to protect them from further attacks. Their plan had been simple. Even Lana was not strong enough to break into those deep, atomic bomb-proof bunkers, and if she tried to attack them, the team assigned to guard them would seal the doors and wait for John and Quavos to come to their aid. But Lana had not been so blunt or predictable. She had spread her net wider, and first Neil's aunt's entire family, and then two of Madeline's college-age cousins had been found. All had suffered the same horrifying fate that had become Lana's trademark, and it had become ever harder to keep the whole string of deaths secret. Moving as if at random, Lana would strike and then vanish. Each time she struck, a massive team would descend on the area in an attempt to flush her out. 3 times, one of the many FBI teams searching for her had found her, At least, that was what Ayala and her advisors assumed had happened. No one from the ill-fated teams had survived the encounters to report on what had actually transpired. As Lana's net widened, so did the group of people sequestered, and a race had formed between Lana's appetite for cold-blooded murder and the FBI's ability to gather every cousin, best friend, ex-boyfriend, college mentor, or other randomly associated character from Neil's or Madeline's past. Intermingled amongst the killings, Lana then started more wholesale attacks. Neil's hometown high school was first to go. Lana left nothing but a burning hulk to mark the graves of the children who had been unable to escape the inferno. Then the Marine Research Institute, where Neil had first met Madeline and the doomed James Hodgson, had been spectacularly demolished. Since then, the array Neil had worked at had been shut down, and Madeline's high school had been temporarily closed due to fire hazards. Lana had turned Neil and Madeline into pariahs. Anything they had ever touched in their lives was being systematically turned to dust. Any relationships that predated the madness that had been the last 2 years had been utterly violated. But in the end, Madeline had suffered the greatest loss, and the first, with the gruesome murder of her mother, and she was still the most devastated. Madeline stared at the wall through eyes strained by the weight of her grief, and anger tempered her breathing. Ayala had given up trying to console her with hugs or kind words at Madeline's strong request. She had had enough of that. Madeline needed action. She needed Ayala to find the bitch, and then she needed John and Qualos to kill her, and in the meantime, Madeline needed to throw herself into her work. Madeline sensed that Ayala was about to speak and held up her hand. Her own voice came out shakily at first, but became stronger as she spoke. Don't, Ayala. I know there is nothing more you can do. And I know that you don't begrudge me my tantrums, which I am grateful for. That's why I let it rip on you rather than on my team. She looked at Ayala and managed an askew smile, which was answered by a simple nod. How long do we have till takeoff? Said Ayala, taking Madeline's cue. 2 hours. But there's really nothing more for my team to do. It's in the hands of NASA and the ESA now. Ayala nodded. Shall we head down to Mission Control, or do you need a minute? Madeline shook her head firmly and stood, her chair grinding on the concrete floor as her legs pushed it back. 2 hours later, Madeline stood amongst a seemingly chaotic throng of people, some standing and some sitting at terminals. Voices rang out with updates and confirmations, checklists ticking down through the exhaustive process of the last of 5 launches from this site in only a few weeks. Technicians typed furiously on keyboards as swaths of information slid across screens in the final frenetic build-up to takeoff. The massive volume of information passed of Mission Control through a thick vein of optic cables surging under a concrete plane for over a quarter of a mile to the tall scaffolding that supported the vehicle they were prepping. The cables then joined a maze of wires, hoses, and pipes that converged on the base of the launch pad like roots, carrying their wares to every one of the 1,000 systems they fed. From fuel stirrers to ignition control, from bridge retraction motors to the still hardwired telemetry that linked them to the astronauts on board. 07:34:44 p.m. Countdown begins. T-minus 9 minutes. The frantic activity of 1,000 technicians stops for a moment's peace as the countdown begins, an enforced time of careful review and consideration. 07:36:14 p.m. Access arm retracts. The crew aboard the Orion multi-purpose crew vehicle, nervous despite their countless hours of training, busy themselves throughout the retraction of their access bridge, symbolic of their cutting off from the ground below. 07:38:44 p.m. Launch window open. Hydraulic power system APU start. Stepping into their window of opportunity, the sense of urgency builds. The reality of the launch becomes tangible. Nerves tingle as possibility turns into imminent reality. 07:38:49 p.m. LO2 replenish terminates. Fuel loaded, systems ready. Cool liquid oxygen propellant stirs in the rocket's vast tanks, waiting to expand itself in flaming glory as the rocket surges into space. 07:39:44 p.m.